Well, I am excited to be here. It's a great day to study the economics of agriculture. I love what I do, and I am a Missouri native, and so Dr. Hatley set me up perfect because I was going to talk about irrigation. I grew up, our farm's on western Missouri, and we've been talking about adding irrigation to our operation for a long time. Some of our neighbors are, but I'm going to give you the framework that we use to make the decision not to in western Missouri, okay? And I don't have to tell you all, but agriculture is risky. We know that, right? We're willing to accept some of that because we have a livelihood that we love. We get to work with the land. We have something that's very rewarding to us. And so we're able to take some of that risk. But what I'm going to talk to you today about is something that I'm very passionate about, and that's risk management. And we spend a lot of time doing risk at Ohio State. And I'm going to show you some numbers that we calculated the last couple of years as I've traveled around the state. But I'll tell you first and foremost that if you're looking for a risk management strategy and you want your same level of profitability or your same level of returns, it doesn't exist, right? There is some trade-off between increased profitability and taking risk, right? We know that. You got to risk it to get the biscuit, as they used to say, or they probably still say, right? And so we're going to talk through a framework. Now, I've learned, I like frameworks, but I've learned that producers don't necessarily like frameworks. They want more tangible, applicable stuff, so that you all don't get as excited about frameworks as what we do in academia. But I am excited, and I am looking forward to sharing this. So I'm going to make a deal with you. I'm going to talk a little bit about a framework, and then we'll get into some action steps I think are maybe realistic and maybe even possible here in 2019. So I'm excited to be here. I'm thankful for the opportunity. And I just want to start off with a couple of logistics. First and foremost, we do run a site. We run two sites at Ohio State. I have the first one, farm management. We have a bunch of resources related to grain markets. We're continuing to build this. So it's me, and we're continuing to build this. We haven't had a lot of time the last year and a half because I'm not really sure who decided to put a trade negotiation, a farm bill, a new farm bill, and then prevent plant all within the same year. But it's definitely given me some job security, I'll tell you that. And so we do have a site, and then the farm office offers some tools by Barry Ward, and then Peggy Hall has her Ag Law blog on there as well. So just a couple of sites. This presentation and webinar will be down at the bottom. We have several webinars available too. So let's talk a little bit about an outline for today. I want to talk about what is risk. As I've traveled the state, I've realized that people continue to confuse risk and uncertainty. Okay, and to understand that is critical for what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about that framework that I talked about. I'm going to show you where you as producers and some of your fellow brothers and sisters have put your risk and where you place your risk sources. We're going to talk about management plans, and I'm going to give you those common challenges to grain marketing. It's kind of my action step, my takeaway from today. So my goal is to get us done by 12. That was what time I was supposed to be done. So we're running a little bit behind, but I'm going to get us caught up. I do want to point out it is my dad's birthday. So today's his 60th birthday. My mom sent me this picture this morning, so I threw it on here real quick. He's using his OSU seed gauge, and he's got an OSU hat on. Now, keep in mind, I come from a very Mizzou, University of Missouri type family, so to get him to switch to that must show that Ohio State's got some really good qualities. And Aaron mentioned that I'm learning to love Ohio. On the way here, I played the Ohio State fight song to get me pumped up. So if that is not evidence that I am becoming to love Ohio, I don't know what is. Now, my mom would tell me that this picture of my dad shows his best side. I'm not sure Dad would want me to show this, but nonetheless, here we are. So let me start off and just explain a little bit about what we've done. This is a combination of slides. I don't expect you to realize this, but what I did is I took a couple of graphs from my Outlook presentations this winter, okay? And I threw them on a slide, not really, I mean, they're updated, but my favorite mentor, Alan Lyons, is here, one of my favorite mentors, and I'm sure Alan's been retired for a while, but I'm sure Alan has a slide deck in his briefcase that he pulls out and updates periodically, and if he gets asked to do a presentation, he's ready to go, right, Alan? I mean, maybe, yes, right? As Agriculture Outlook and marketing specialists, we do this. We come in, I give you 3 reasons why the markets might go up. I give you 2 reasons why the markets go down. I thank you for lunch, and I say, thank you for bringing me to Plain City, right? That's what we do, whether it's an Ag Outlook or whatever. But we're missing, this is only the first step of the equation. The second step of this equation is how does this fit into a risk plan? Okay, now most of the time we don't get to this, and producers would rather hear the first thing, and ideally what I'd like to say is you learn something from me, you go home and you apply this to your risk strategy. However, this winter, I was in Northwest Ohio. It was February 13th. I told this group of farmers, producers, that soybean prices looked pretty good, at that time. Futures price was 9.70. We were dealing for November. We were dealing with a 50-cent negative basis, so we're looking at a 9.20 cash price in Northwest Ohio. And I said these prices don't make sense. And I said, it'd be to your wise to sell ahead. And the response I got back was, well, Ben, we can't sell something we don't have. And I said, well, okay. I said, well, can you make money at 9.30? All the heads nodded. And then I asked, well, how many of you are selling at 9.30? And not a single hand went up, okay? Now, I realize that there is some production risk here, but crop insurance has helped us with that, and we're able to be a little more aggressive on our risk management thanks to that. But we don't take advantage of some of these practices and solutions that we should. So we're going to talk through them. Just real quick, I want to show you, this is kind of my update for the market, my one-slide update. I think to this point, the markets are taking into account some yield reduction or some acre reductions. We've talked about the acreage. We've spent a lot of time talking about acreage. But what I've got here is this is the amount of acres in each state with poor to very poor crop conditions. Here, pretty quick, we're going to be starting to talk about yield and the quality of this year's crop and what's available to it. And so, just something to think in mind and keep in mind as we start thinking about this. I think we could see a little bit of a market reaction, but prices don't have to go higher. There's a lot of grain still sitting out there. I know because I've talked to several of you, and you've got grain sitting in your bin, and you've got this dream that, just like Neil Armstrong went to the moon, we've got dreams that corn prices are going to the moon. They don't have to. They can, but they don't have to. So let's start and talk about risk and uncertainty. First and foremost, risk involves making a decision. If you decide not to do something, that is making a decision not to. If you decide to do something, you're taking on that risk. The uncertainty part of it is what happens next. What is the deviation from normal? And we'll talk about this in just a second. But no decision equals no risk, and there are very few decisions within agriculture. In fact, I can't think of any that whether you decide to do or don't do something don't involve some type of risk. If you decide not to plant in a year, you're taking a risk on your financial position, especially if your operation depends on that income for your source. So what do we do? And this is where Dr. Hatley kind of set me up just a little bit. Enter economics. What I love. I go around and spread the gospel of economics all the time, and I love this. But it's a decision framework that I hope you can take and use. Now, it's one of those things that it's not attractive. It's not fun to do. I say it's not sexy at all, but it is one of those things that you need to do, and especially as margins become tighter and we start dealing with more and more challenges and more decisions, you're going to need something to fall back on that allows you to help make these decisions, because the average farmer faces 1,100 decisions each year, okay? When we start taking that in and we start thinking about all the things that we need to manage, we become overwhelmed and we become stressed. And then it leads to poor mental health, poor health, and other things. So what does this look like? I've made a very simple returns and profitability function. Now this is very nerdy, I realize that. But basically, every decision you have can be made into this graph. Now there might be spokes that go out, so there might be phases that come out. But I've given you my intention is to plant corn. And I've given two possibilities. I can either get my corn planted or I cannot plant corn. Right? The two things you need to understand here and get a return metric is you need to know what the payout is for each one of those. Okay? You need to spend time and come out with the payout. So in the case for planting corn, I'm specifically just putting what my trend adjusted yield is for crop insurance, or what is my average yield for a 10-year period. Whatever that might be, that's what I'm planning if I get my crop planted. And then I'm going to take that times some average price, and I'm going to get a value for that, right? Or I'm going to get a price that I think. Now, I could go out from that and then start looking at price as a component, but you first got to start here. On the bottom side is not planting corn. Now, what I've simply done here is I've just taken what the crop insurance gives me in terms of a guarantee, okay? So that 150. The middle there where it says the P's, where it shows probability, okay, this is the occurrence of something actually happening. So what I'm showing there is that for a probability of getting my corn planted, 93 years out of 100, I'm going to get my corn in. 7 years out of 100, I'm not going to get my corn in. And what I do is then I take 93 times my 180, I take 7% times my 150, and I'm getting an expected return at 178. Okay? Now we're going to talk about switching that here in a second, but you got to understand this first. You got to understand this concept. Now, farming becomes gambling when expected returns, when that 178 is below my cost of production. Think of a lottery ticket for just a second. The average $1 lottery ticket, so if you buy a $1 lottery ticket, the average return back is 55 cents. Why would I spend $1 if my expected return is 55 cents, right? That's the definition of gambling. This is how casinos make their money. In agriculture, we deal with this exactly the same thing. Now, you can take a gamble in years as long as it's not a huge portion of your portfolio, and as long as you don't do it that often, right? You can help mitigate some of those challenges as we look through. So first and foremost, I want you to understand that, because now what I want is variability versus uncertainty. Okay, variability is finding patterns in a market. What I've got here is I've got Ohio corn prices. So these are the prices you all have received for the last 70 years, 60 years. And they're broken out by decade. Each line represents a decade. And what I want to show here is going through all these price patterns, right? We had the golden age of agriculture in the early, 2010 to 11, 12. We had the big price spike up. We had the Russian grain embargo in the 80s. We had the Russian grain steal in the 70s, right? And we've seen all these these climate changes, these countries coming in and producing more, and it hasn't changed our price pattern, because we still produce corn in April, May, June, and we still harvest corn in September, October, maybe November, right? So we've still got our price pattern. So what we've got here is an index, and what I'm showing you is that on average, if we look there in October, on average, our price is about 5 to 8% lower than what our normal mean is for the year. And it rises through the spring, early summer, peaks in the midsummer, and then falls to go back into harvest, right? Now, can it vary within a year? Absolutely, and it does. And I'll show that in just the next slide. But our patterns have not changed, and we can use this to our advantage. We can use this strategy to help us figure out, when and how do we put this into a marketing plan. So let me show you. This is just the 2010. So this is that same graph I just showed you where we saw the same price pattern. Now these are individual years, right? Probably the most noticeable one is the orange line there at the top. Now that's 2010, 2011. That was going into the late planting there in 2010 or 11 to help insulate prices and bring it up. If we look, the light blue line is our current year. Now I don't have June in the system yet, but I'm expecting it to continue to go up as we've seen cash prices continue to increase. So what am I saying here? Variability is our price pattern that I just showed you. The uncertainty is how different are we going to be from that average every year. That's our uncertainty. We know what's fact is that we have a price pattern. Our uncertainty is how different are we going to be. And so if I take what Aaron gave this morning, Dr. Wilson gave this morning, and I think about this increasing water, this chances of more water in the spring not getting planted, and I go back to my simple graph here, and I'm thinking about my decisions I've got to make over the long term. What I've done is I've now changed those probabilities based on what Aaron helped present this morning. Instead of 93 years out of 100, I'm getting my corn in. Now I'm only 85 years out of 100 getting my corn in. And look what it's done to my future payout. We've decreased the future payout. And as that decreases, you as producers are going to need to decide what your risk portfolio is. Now, it is hard for me to stand up here and give a golden ticket that's going to work for everybody in terms of risk management. And this is where individual, working to figure out your risk scenarios and your risk preferences, how risk-loving, how risk-averse you are. But it also comes down to finances. I don't know what your finances are for risk. I don't know what your preferences, but I also don't know your options to mitigate risk, right? We have some solutions. I'll give you a couple ideas. But this is where understanding and putting everything into context, if as we move forward and as markets continue to be volatile, up till this point, we've really relied on technology to help us mitigate some risk. We think about seed varieties have helped us mitigate the downside of drought. Tile, irrigation are helping us with some of our weather. Think about like the Central Valley out in California. They don't get a lot of rain. They live in a drought, so they basically have a controlled environment, climate environment, right? And they're able to do that. But then they face other issues. And this bottom down here is kind of where I was getting. These are the 5 sources of risk identified by the Risk Management Agency. Price and marketing risk is an option. That's pretty self-explanatory. Knowing where input prices are. We don't typically think of input prices being a risk, but they are. Production risk. This is probably the one you all spend the most time with, and where weather becomes a little bit tricky because we can't control for weather here in Ohio. We can't control it, so we tend to think of weather as an output risk, but weather can also be an input risk, like what we found this year in terms of getting our seed in. If we think back to the fall, weather prevented us from doing a lot of our field work and nutrient application last fall. So it can be a challenge there. Legal risk, government, and policy, or regulatory. This is one that continues to increase as we think about, how does weather affect, some of our problems with regulatory issues? Does that fit in there? The one thing I don't have on that is being able to transition a farm business and thinking about estate and family transitions. That would be fit into what we call institutional risk there in third. 4, human resources. This probably isn't as common in crops as it is in dairy, but what happens if your workers don't show up on your farm, right? What are you going to do then? In crops, that human resources may be probably that relationship with a grain elevator or somebody making sure, a crop insurance agent, having that relationship, making sure that you're connecting there and you're not facing a risk of something going south. And then financial. What happens if the bank denies your operating loans? I know we've got several bankers in the room, but I come from Western Missouri. We're starting to see operating loans denied in Western Missouri, Kansas, and Nebraska. So what happens if your operating loan happens? Now, these are a lot of choices. I've told you farmers face about 1,100 annually. So what I've got here is a framework, and this is my framework. This is my pinwheel. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on it, but we could spend a whole day. And to do it right, you need to spend several days going through this. On campus, when we have students go through this program, by the time they get done, they have a book, but they've got a risk management plan, okay? They have their plan, they update it, but once you've got it, it doesn't take as much time. The total time commitment or the big time commitment's up front. But if you think about it in terms of 3 areas, and I've got it split out with those black lines, you have your strategic area. And the way I always phrase this is hard for us in agriculture to do. We tend not to spend much time in strategic areas. And I always relate it to, I'm a pasty white kid from Western Missouri where the sun's up. When I was a child and we were going to the swimming pool, do you think I took time to calculate my risk exposure to sun? Do you think I took time to put on sunscreen? Hell no, I jumped right in the pond. Okay, so we don't spend time with strategic areas. The next one is our intentional. So this is where we think about our probability of risk happening. This is that slide that I showed you on the slide, a couple of that tree. You have to know your expected payouts and you have to know your probability. If you don't know those two, you can't have an effective risk management plan. And it might seem hard to know what your probability is, but there are ways to calculate it, and you need that to have a solid risk management plan. If you don't have one, okay? And then the last one is the managerial component. Putting something in action, tweaking it, adjusting as you go through, and then on the back end, doing the evaluation. We work for Ohio State. I work for Ohio State. One of the things that we have to do is we have to evaluate our programs to see if they're meeting your all's needs as clients. I'm hoping at the end of this, you all give me a 5 on a 5-point scale, not 10, but a 5-point scale. But we have to evaluate how relevant we have to be, right? And so I encourage you to think about that for your operation. If that's something that I can take away today with you today, is within this framework, there are 2 areas where we tend not to spend much time. It's on that strategic area and it's in the managerial area. Now, everything starts with finances, right? If you don't know your finances from a cost of production or a couple other scenarios, you can't put together a risk management plan because you don't know where your risk is. The 5 areas of finance that you need to know are liquidity. A risk management plan depends on you being able to act quickly, make decisions. Liquidity is, land is less liquid than cash, okay? So you need liquidity. Second thing is solvency, being able to pay off debt. If you can't pay off debt, we've got issues, right? Long-term issues. But also with debt is, gosh, am I already out of time? Okay, I'll work on this. So anyways, yes, I talk too much. I forgot my Nerf gun. I was going to bring my Nerf gun to talk about a point today, and then I realized Gary Brzezinski was here and I didn't want to get fired. But I had a really great point with the Nerf gun. And so anyways, debt repayment capacity, not only our ability to pay off our debts, but to pay them off on time. That is important. The 4th one is profitability. That's important, obviously, for a number of reasons. And then the 5th one is financial efficiency. How good are we at turning expenses into revenue? And managing that and knowing where your benchmark is between high and low. So those all are important. So I'm going to skip over. I had some more things I wanted to talk about, but I'm going to skip over that. Let me get to this slide. This is what your fellow brothers and sisters have told me for the last couple years in terms of identifying risk. And what I've got over here on the left, your left, is the type of risk by rank. Not surprising, most of you said price risk. The next one, production, then regulation. Regulation kept coming up as a high program. But if we break risk and production down, 1 means it's a low risk, 5 means it's a high risk. And I look at production risk, or price risk, the first thing that comes up is negative margins. And that continues to grow as we think about it. If I jump down to production real quick, I just want to jump down because I'm going to kind of speed through some stuff, is if I jump down to production, weather showed up as the 4th most important production risk to you all. I would guess that if I did that again today, it would be a little bit higher on the scale. But we'd had 6 years of above trend corn yields. You guys had forgot about production risk. Don't do that. Don't forget about your risk. This is why going through, identifying your risk, coming up with the risk alternatives, and going through the situation is really important every year, and reevaluating, because then you don't expose yourselves when things come up. Okay. There's 4 ways to handle risk, and I want to cover these real quick. You can avoid risk. In agriculture, this probably isn't your best strategy. If you avoid risk altogether, guess what? It's probably not going to end great, right? You can transfer risk. Most of the time, we can't transfer the full thing, but I think of crop insurance. We're transferring risk to the general public through federal crop insurance. If I think about grain markets, we're transferring some of that risk on price to speculators in the market. So just things to have. Then you can assume and retain risk, very similar to avoid. Assuming and retaining risk likely causes you some significant downside. But as I talked about, you're not paying for anything. You don't have an expense, so maybe you're able to capture those high-end revenues. So there are people out in western Kansas that assume and retain risk. They like it because they're looking for those long-term big booms, and they make money. And we see over time that by being more risky, you get more money. But you've got to have the financial capital and the whereabouts. And so it's not a strategy I recommend. But again, it's a trade-off between more money and being more all the good things, or mitigating your risk, right? That's the trade-off. So graphically, this is just how it looks. And I'll go through really quick. Again, these slides are all on. I'll do a webinar so that way you can see the full thing. But if you want to manage your price risk on the bottom of that first graph with probability on your left, we can shrink through hedging those 2 extremes. Yes, you're not getting the high end, but you're also not getting the low end. With a forward contract, now all of a sudden you're getting that dotted line. You know what your price is at the beginning, right? Now we've managed price risk, but we've done nothing to manage your production risk with this strategy. If we think about the next one, we're shifting that risk a little bit towards the higher end. This would be like storing grain, putting grain in the bin, waiting till those springs. I showed you those seasonal price patterns, right? Putting grain in the bin, waiting till the spring, taking advantage of that market carry. Now, that's probably not a great strategy for this year coming up because we've got negative carry, or potentially we're getting small carry. It's not negative yet, but we're getting small carry. And hopefully I get to that slide, but we'll talk about that. And then the bottom 2 down here, with yield or with irrigation and drainage, we've tilted that risk to the positive side through drainage. Based on Aaron's talk, the first thing I would do and spend money at is put drainage in. To manage. I mean, that's it does shift that up, irrigation down on the bottom end too. I will tell you that in Missouri, I told you we were thinking about irrigation. If I go back to that payoff matrix, it doesn't pay. The benefits from irrigation do not outweigh the cost of doing irrigation, so we haven't implemented it. A lot of our neighbors have, but we've been pretty confident in our decision. And then the 4th one would be crop insurance or insurance contracts, like buying a put or selling a call or something. You're cutting off that low-end tier, but still getting your high-end. Now, both of those cost money. You have to have money. You pay money to get that, to reduce that risk on the down end. So just a couple of alternatives. Crop insurance is a way to transfer risk. It is bid at a premium. Crop insurance agents aren't willing to sell insurance at a price that producers are willing to buy without some type of government cost share. And so that's where we get that wedge, largely due to moral hazard and adverse selection. I won't talk about those, but crop insurance and revenue insurance have allowed us to be more aggressive in our marketing plans and really help with some of our downside risk. The comment I would have here, and if I had more time I'd go into it, is what is your plan if all of a sudden crop insurance gets cut or goes away, or no longer we have the prevent plant option, right? Those type of questions are going to continue to come up in the policy cycle. From a producer standpoint, you hope they never go through, but it is a risk. That's a policy and government risk that you have to manage for. Forward contracting and futures contracts, like I said earlier, are all options, but they transfer risk to the general public, but they don't do anything for your production risk. You still have to produce a crop. You still have to have a crop to take those into account, but they do manage some of your price risk. And then diversification. This is probably one of the ones that I would seriously encourage Ohio producers to think about. My best example is who won the Super Bowl this year? Does anybody remember the Super Bowl? Who won?
Who cares?
Exactly, right? Okay, so the best protest, the Buckeyes. Protest, if you ask who won the Super Bowl, guess the Patriots. You got pretty good odds. But, the big thing you probably remember from the Super Bowl is what happened during one of the commercials related to corn and a certain beer, right? All of a sudden we know. We remember this date, right? Okay, my biggest example that I have about diversification comes from the commercials that came during the Super Bowl. There was one commercial that talked about not having corn in a certain beer. That same company, 3 commercials later, had a commercial that talked about organic grain in one of their beers. Then 3 commercials later, there was another commercial that talked about, I think so. There was another commercial that talked about, a beer that we all seemed to like, right? And all of a sudden, now we really like this beer, so we're switching over there. All 3 beers owned by the same company. Do you know what happened to their profits and their revenue? They went up. They knew their diversity portfolio and knew that by targeting certain things that they would be more diverse. In agriculture, we can do the same thing. But the trick is you can't have 2 crops. I mean, diversity comes in a lot of different measures. But if you have 2 crops with the same cycle and the same characteristics, you're not diverse. Corn and soybeans is not a diverse option. It does help on the agronomy side. Same thing with adding barley. It's an option. It adds some extra risk, but it adds some diversity. Livestock is a big diverse option in Ohio, having grain and livestock. So thinking about some of those things, we see more and more people out in Kansas and Missouri buy land that's further away from their house because they know that if a storm or a hailstorm comes up, that hail's not going to take out all their cropland, right? And so we see diversification by the geographical location. On the marketing side, spreading out your sales over multiple time periods, you're not maybe going to get every contract's going to have the highest end, but you're at least guaranteeing some of your contracts to have the highest end of the equation. So just things to think about. I'm going to skip this slide, but basically this is low production risk. There are ways to mitigate, low production risk. We've seen it in different cases, but bottom line, there's lots of alternatives. I don't know what all the options are for your operation, but I encourage you to come up with a list, talk with your county agent, talk with a friend, a neighbor, come up with that list, and then think through, what are the payoffs for my operation, and thinking back and using that tree that I showed you earlier in terms of making a decision. So price risk, real quick. I've got 10 minutes. I'm sorry, but I got 10 minutes, so we're going to go rather quick. This is, price is still a function of supply and demand modified by the flow of money. When I was a kid, I remember going to the grain elevator. About the time I was old enough to drive a grain truck, I went down the elevator. The local grain guy told me that price was a function of greed and fear. Well, no, it's not greed and fear. It's supply and demand modified by the flow of money. And that modified by the flow of money is important. That's where you get the variation from the line, the dotted line. That's where you get it. But there is a noticeable break at about 10% stock to use, meaning how much grain do we have on hand versus how much do we use. Once we hit about that 10% mark, that's when we start to see prices really increase. That purple dot represents about where we're at. And if you can't see where the purple dot is, it's kind of in the middle there. We're moving closer to that. We keep shrinking stocks. I think we're going to shrink more stocks this year. But there's still large amounts of grain out in the elevator, or out in the elevators, out in the farm side. And so how do we get that into the market? Well, you all are sitting there saying grain's going higher, so I'm going to hold off my grain till grain goes higher, but don't miss it, right? This is, if I think back to 2011 in Missouri and Kansas, I assume in Ohio too, we had a lot of producers that missed that cycle in 2011 because, they just waited. Corn price was going to continue to go up. It had to. Now, it paid off pretty well because 2012 ended up being a drought year, but it didn't look so good there for a while, okay? So you've heard, I'm going to skip my story about oranges, but some of you have heard my story about oranges, but my first marketing experience was in orange contracts. How many orange trees do you think are in Kansas? Exactly. So it didn't go the best, but I've learned from that and I've moved on. So if I've got 4 tips, Aaron, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 5 minutes? Okay. If I think about common challenges in grain marketing, and especially for this year and maybe going forward, reluctance, I'm a big fan of pre-marketing harvest plans, okay? Now, farmers have a big reluctancy to this because, one, how can you sell something that you don't currently own? But I showed you those price patterns earlier. Use your crop insurance to your advantage. Take advantage of some of those opportunities. If you don't have a crop, then we start talking about rolling options and stuff like that, right? But that's the second thing. If you don't take advantage of a pre-harvest marketing plan, you've missed your first option. The second option is a post-harvesting market, so after the crop comes out of the field, right? That's your second option. If you miss the first one, only focus on the second one, guess what? You don't get to go back to the first one, right? So why not at least consider your first option? And if it's above your cost of production, go ahead and start thinking about moving some grain. I see some people nodding their head. I also see some people with their arms crossed because I know that this is uncomfortable, but it's a very realistic scenario. Second thing, understanding your local basis. I have found that producers and even us, I'm partially to blame. Economists we're partially blamed because we've taught basis wrong. We taught basis as the difference in transportation costs. So if there was a 10-cent difference between two elevator locations, the philosophy was that it was, or let's say the basis is 50 cents lower in Ohio. The philosophy was it would cost us 50 cents a bushel to get from the elevator to the port in New Orleans, right? Well, that's part of the equation. The other part of the equation is what we call temporal basis. I'm going to slip a couple of slides. It's what we call temporal basis, and this is where storage costs come in, and it's a function of your local supply and demand at your local elevator. I would argue as we've grown and as we've added more storage across the country, as we've gone to online technical trading, as we've added overnight trading, all right, we've increased our variability in basis, and producers must understand your basis. Okay, if you don't understand your basis, you're limiting yourselves on your risk management plan. So know what your local basis pattern is, and then when is it the strongest and when is the weakest. Hedge to arrive contracts are really popular because it allows you to set your basis at a later time. But if you don't know when your basis is, that contract doesn't become a very useful option. So if we look at, this is North Central Ohio soybean basis. The red line is our average for this type of year. You can see the big black drop. That's largely just due to large storage costs. We had too much. The grain elevator was telling us to keep those soybeans on farm. They didn't want to take those costs. And so they pushed it out to the farm. Now they're needing soybeans. There's the possibility of a short crop. That basis is strengthening. We see our cash prices increase. So, I've got a couple of questions here, but if I look down here to question one, if at harvest time, or excuse me, if it's planting time and my local elevator is offering me $8.80, the futures price is $9.60, so there's an 80-cent difference, but I know my local basis is usually 35 to 55 cents. Is a forward contract a good option? No. We know that our basis is weak. So, knowing and understanding your basis helps understand what grain marketing situation works best for you. Here's corn basis. And again, I showed 2010, 2011 in the purple. Grain basis always gets weaker at harvest, right? So understand that the cash prices have been increasing lately. Part of that's due to that strong basis. I wish Sam was here. I'd ask him what basis in Western Ohio is today. I assume it's 75 over still. But it will start shrinking soon. So don't miss your opportunity. If you're thinking about marketing grain, if you're tempted to, don't miss your opportunity. It looks favorable, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Have an exit strategy. I'm skipping over some slides, but have an exit strategy. I heard too many producers this fall say, I still got grain in the bin. I'm waiting for it to go back up a little bit, especially soybeans in April. And I kept asking the question, well, what are you waiting for? And they said, well, I'm waiting for that 30 cents back. And I just kind of nodded my head while they're paying 6 cents storage cost, 2 cents interest cost, right? So I'm nodding my head and trying to figure out. The best case was back in 2007 when soybean prices were $10.50. They didn't reach $10.50 again until 2012, okay? So, that was an opportunity where we were seeing major storage costs, producers increasing their load. So I've got two strategies here. Have a price-driven strategy. Know what price maybe you want to get out of the market at, but be realistic. Is $12 soybeans very realistic? No, probably not. Is $8 corn very realistic? You might think it is, but it's still far-fetched, to be honest with you. So have a price-driven strategy, have a time-driven strategy. Maybe divide that up into a couple of loads, spread your sales out maybe once, March 1st, April 1st, May 1st, something like that, to diversify your sales, keep them all at the same thing. And then the final thing, the final takeaway that I have for you, at least in terms of this section, I really regret that I didn't get more time to spend on each of these, but is know your carrying charges. I hear too many people tell me, Ben, we sell our grain at harvest and then we buy calls back to take advantage if the market goes up. And that's what this purple bar is showing you down here. As that purple bar goes up, they're buying calls to protect themselves in case the market goes up. If the market goes down, they've just lost 33 cents. That's all they've lost. But at least they're able to take advantage of that upside. My trouble with this is that only works if the market is inverted or narrow. The carrying cost is narrow. We see carrying cost narrow right now. If I look out to June right now, July, we're at like 23% full carry, 23% of our full carry. And I've got carry explained on this slide. Sorry, I probably should have switched these back around. But we're at 23% full carry. And so when carry is shallow like this, that strategy works out. But now I've got people, those same people that told me they sell at harvest and then buy a call for later on are now telling me, oh, we're going to put it in storage. Baffles my mind because they're paying for the storage cost under this strategy. If carry is full, you're paying for storage cost, even if you think you're avoiding your on-farm bin storage. So at the end of the day, are you going to lose more sleep if you sold and the markets go up, but you sold it at a profit? Are you going to lose sleep if you didn't sell and markets tank and fall out of the park, right? I guess I'm just trying in a way to be helpful to you and to help mitigate some of your risk. And I think, that's a very good question to ask yourself. So in conclusion, here's really my takeaways. I think we got to all of these. I skipped over some stuff, but figure out your risk preferences. You all have different risk preferences in terms of what you like, how much risk you're willing to take on, and how much risk you want to mitigate. It is a function of higher returns versus lower risk, right? That is a challenge. It's a trade-off, and I encourage you to think through that. We used to talk about managing your farm's risk. We are now at the point where you need to manage your individual field risk, okay? Pretty soon we're going to be talking about foot-by-foot squares in your field, to where I go out and we can tell a marginal cost and a marginal benefit function for each foot in your field. And I know that probably didn't make any sense, but you got to manage on a field basis. Know what those risk portfolios and your risk preference is for each field in your operation. Create a list of alternatives. My hope is for you to go home today and sit down and think of a list of alternatives, and then be creative. Talk to your neighbors, talk to your friends, talk to your county extension educators, and come up with a list and then identify the payoffs for each other's. And then my last one is have a marketing strategy. Again, I go back, there's two parts to a marketing strategy, the pre-harvest and the post-harvest. If you miss the pre-harvest, you've only got the second one to fall back on. At least if you consider the first one, you've got two options, right? So at least consider a pre-harvest marketing strategy as well, but have a marketing plan in place, and then don't be afraid to ask for help if you need it. That's why we're here. That's why I'm at Ohio State, and I love what I do. Okay, so don't be afraid to ask for it. And then finally, just a little bit of promotion. We've got a number of events coming up. We've got our National Ag Outlook is in Ohio this year. So I don't know why I thought I needed to add one more thing to my plate. But our National Ag Outlook's in Cincinnati. If you want to come down, we've got a great line of speakers. Our Ag Outlook on campus will be November 2nd for Ohio. We do this every year. And then we're actively doing Farm Bill meetings. We're just finishing up the dairy margin coverage meetings. We'll be starting ARC and PLC meetings in September for those of you that need to make a decision between ARC and PLC. And so with that, that's my contact information. As always, if you need anything, I encourage you to lean on your land grant. We love being here for you. It's our job. It's what we love to do. So thank you. I'd be willing to take any questions anybody might have.